May 15th, 2014. Uncovered the nearly complete skeleton of a teenage girl, a long argument that had divided archaeologists studying. That's the exact controversy Naya's DNA was finally able to settle. Genetic analysis of mitochondrial DNA extracted from one of Naya's molars revealed that this prehistoric teenage girl carried genetic markers common to modern Native Americans, according to the researchers behind the study published in Science. The findings show that despite the clear physical differences between the skulls of the earliest Americans and the skulls of modern Native American populations, they were in fact significantly related, almost certainly deriving from the same original ancestral gene pool. Specifically, Naya's mitochondrial DNA belonged to a subgroup known as haplogroup D1, one of 5 major mitochondrial haplogroups found among indigenous peoples of the Americas, alongside haplogroups A, B, C, and X. The significance of that specific haplogroup runs deep, connecting Naya's individual story to a much larger scientific framework explaining how humans actually reached the Americas in the first place. The broader D haplogroup is thought to have originated somewhere in Asia roughly 48,000 years ago, but this particular subgroup, D1, occurs only in the Americas, nowhere else on Earth. Finding this exact genetic marker in a skeleton, this old adds significant weight to what researchers call the Beringian standstill hypothesis, the theory holding that the original ancestral population of Native Americans was genetically isolated from other Asian populations for many thousands of years, likely stranded on the now submerged land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska during the height of the last ice age, before finally dispersing southward into the rest of the Americas once the ice sheets began retreating. Researchers behind that hypothesis, led by geneticist Erica Tam and colleagues, estimate that Asian and American mitochondrial DNA haplogroups diverged from one another more than 25,000 years ago, but that the American branch didn't actually spread out across the New World until less than 15,000 years ago. Naya's age, sitting somewhere between 12 and 13,000 years old, falls perfectly within that predicted chronological window, adding yet another concrete data point supporting the entire theory. Think about what that Beringian standstill hypothesis actually requires you to imagine. An entire founding population of ancient humans, cut off from both their Asian relatives to the west and the unexplored American continent to the east, essentially trapped on a strip of now vanished land for thousands upon thousands of years, slowly accumulating genetic differences in isolation before finally being released, as the retreating ice finally opened a viable path south, to spread out and eventually populate 2 entire continents. Naya's DNA is a direct genetic signature of exactly that isolated waiting population, carried forward in her own body until the day she fell to her death in a Yucatan sinkhole. Recovering Naya's remains for proper scientific study came with its own real complications, and not just the obvious technical difficulty of diving over 100 feet down into a flooded, boulder-strewn cave. The operation was complicated further by the fact that divers who had visited Hoyo, Negro without proper authorization, had, at one point, almost knocked Naya's skull off its resting place and into a deep chasm elsewhere in the cave. Chatters described the danger vividly. The floor of that cave is a mess, littered with boulders, some of which are room-sized, and the skull could have dropped another 5 meters into a gap where there would have been no room for a diver, he explained, adding that the area has since been fenced off to prevent any further unauthorized access, compounding the tension of the actual recovery operation. The divers had never picked up Naya's skull before, so we didn't know how strong it was, Chatters recalled. We were praying that it would not just shatter in their hands. It turned out she's as solid as a rock. Part of her remains ultimately had to be removed from Hoyo Negro entirely for safekeeping, specifically because of the earlier damage, and disturbance caused by those unauthorized divers who had moved and damaged some of her bones while taking unofficial photographs of the site. The entire operation was coordinated by Maria del Pilar Luna Ereguerena, head of underwater archaeology from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, working alongside support from the National Geographic Expeditions Council, with the explicit goal of keeping as much of the original site undisturbed and in place as possible. Chatters himself brought a uniquely relevant perspective to this whole investigation, having spent years already embroiled in exactly this same scientific controversy. He was, in fact, the very same scientist who had first studied Kennewick Man, the roughly 9,000-year-old skeleton discovered in Washington state back in 1996, whose unusual, non-typical skull shape had originally sparked years of heated scientific and even legal debate over exactly who the first Americans really were, and whether they were genuinely directly ancestral to modern Native American populations at all. That debate had, for years, carried real political and legal weight, tangled up with disputes between scientists wanting to study ancient remains and Native American tribes, asserting rightful ownership and reburial rights over the bones of their own ancestors. Naya's discovery offered something genuinely new to that entire fraught conversation: hard genetic proof rather than just skeletal guesswork, connecting these strange, narrow-faced Paleo-American skeletons directly to the broader Native American genetic family tree. Chatters was careful, though, to draw an important distinction about exactly what this genetic connection does and doesn't prove, one relevant to exactly the kind of legal and cultural sensitivities surrounding ancient human remains. We're not looking at an ancestor-descendant relationship here, necessarily, he explained. We're simply looking at a common heritage. In other words, Naya herself isn't necessarily a direct, unbroken ancestor of any specific modern Native American individual or tribe alive today. What her DNA proves is something slightly different, but arguably just as significant, that she and modern Native Americans share the same deep ancestral roots, descending from the same original founding population that crossed from Asia into the Americas at the end of the last ice age, even though her own skull happened to retain older, more archaic physical features that had mostly disappeared from later Native American populations by the time skeletal traits had fully settled into their more familiar modern form. That distinction between skull shape and genetic ancestry turns out to be the single most important scientific takeaway from Naya's entire discovery. And it's worth spelling out clearly because it resolves a genuine paradox that had puzzled archaeologists for decades. For years, whenever researchers found ancient American skeletons with narrow, non-typical Paleo-American skull features, like Kennewick Man, or the so-called Luzia skull found in Brazil, a natural but ultimately mistaken assumption crept into scientific discussion, that these unusual skulls must represent an entirely separate founding population, unrelated to the ancestors of modern Native Americans, perhaps arriving via some completely different migration route or from a different source population altogether. Naya's DNA proves that assumption wrong. The same genetic lineage, the same mitochondrial haplogroup found circulating among Native American populations today was already present inside a girl whose skull looked nothing like a typical modern Native American's. The physical shape of these ancient skulls, it turns out, wasn't a sign of separate ancestry at all. It was simply an earlier stage in the same population's physical evolution, a stage that later shifted and changed over thousands of subsequent years of continued human development across the Americas, gradually producing the more familiar skeletal features seen in Native American populations by the time later archaeological sites were formed. October 5th, 2017. In the journal Science, a team of geneticists led by Eska Willerslev. Let's start with the site itself, because Sungheer isn't just old. It's one of the most extraordinary windows into the deep human past that archaeology has ever produced. Radiocarbon dating places the deposits at Sungheer at roughly 34,000 years old, placing the site right at the interface between the early and middle Upper Paleolithic, and making these burials the oldest securely dated modern human interments anywhere in Europe. Hunter? Gatherers who roamed the Russian plains began burying their dead here around 34,000 years ago, and archaeologists have never stopped being fascinated by what they found. The first human fossil ever discovered at the site, the Sungheer 5 cranium, was pulled from the ground in 1964, kicking off decades of careful, painstaking excavation that eventually revealed one of the richest Ice Age burial complexes anywhere on the planet. What makes Sungheer so unusual isn't just its age. It's the sheer, almost incomprehensible wealth buried alongside these bodies. In the first grave, an adult male now known as Sungheer 1, suggesting a slow, ongoing churn of populations moving through, settling, and eventually being succeeded by newcomers across this exact stretch of the Russian plain over a span of tens of thousands of years. According to research out of Cambridge, examining the Kostenki genome also revealed evidence pointing to a previously unrecognized human population lineage, one as ancient as the very earliest splits that occurred among modern human populations after they first left Africa, a hidden branch of humanity's family tree that nobody had previously identified, sitting quietly preserved inside a single ancient skeleton from a Russian riverbank. And there's one more genuinely chilling comparison buried inside the Sungheer research, one that helps explain something far bigger than just the fate of one burial site. Why modern humans succeeded in populating an entire continent when earlier it was something else, some other form of connection or significance that this Ice Age society considered important enough to invest an almost unbelievable amount of labor and material wealth into honoring. The population picture behind all of this adds one final sobering piece of context to just how remarkable the whole Sungheer mating network discovery really is. Genetic modeling based on the Sungheer genomes suggests these people were living in a population of a genuinely small effective size, the kind of tiny scattered group sizes anthropologists associate with hunter-gatherer bands rather than anything resembling a large settled community. Comparing that picture against other early ancient genomes recovered from across Eurasia during roughly this same broad period, including individuals Like the roughly 45,000-year-old man, a long argument that had divided archaeologists studying. That's the exact controversy Naya's DNA was finally able to settle. Genetic analysis of mitochondrial DNA extracted from one of Naya's molars revealed that this prehistoric teenage girl carried genetic markers common to modern Native Americans, according to the researchers behind the study published in Science. The findings show that despite the clear physical differences between the skulls of the earliest Americans and the skulls of modern Native American populations, they were in fact significantly related, almost certainly deriving from the same original ancestral gene pool. Specific discovery so remarkable, it wasn't an easy problem to solve. It was, if anything, one of the hardest possible versions of that problem. Vanishingly few people, spread across an enormous frozen expanse of land, somehow still finding each other often enough and deliberately enough to keep their bloodlines from collapsing in on themselves the way evidence suggests at least one isolated Neanderthal populations did. There's a genuinely striking postscript to this entire story, too. One that shows just how long it eventually took for something we now take completely for granted to actually show up in the archaeological record. According to researchers who study ancient kinship patterns across Eurasia, the earliest molecular identification of an actual nuclear family, a mother, a father, and their biological child, all found buried and genetically confirmed together in a single clear family unit, doesn't appear anywhere in the ancient DNA record until roughly 30,000 years after the time period sung here itself represents. 30,000 years. That's how long it took after these elaborately dressed, deliberately unrelated children were laid to rest head to head under 10,000 ivory beads each before archaeologists have found solid genetic proof, suggesting a slow, ongoing churn of populations moving through, settling, and eventually being succeeded by newcomers across this exact stretch of the Russian plain over a span of tens of thousands of years. According to research out of Cambridge, examining the Kostenki genome also revealed evidence pointing to a previously unrecognized human population lineage, one as ancient as the very earliest splits that occurred among modern human populations after they first left Africa, a hidden branch of humanity's family tree that nobody had previously identified, sitting quietly preserved inside a single ancient skeleton from a Russian riverbank. And there's one more genuinely chilling comparison buried inside the sung here research, one that helps explain something far bigger than just the fate of one burial site. Why modern humans succeeded in populating an entire continent when an earlier at any one time. And yet somehow, deliberately, they had already worked out a functioning system for finding mates outside their own immediate group, maintaining connections and exchange relationships across a much wider social network stretching far beyond whoever they happened to be sharing a campfire with on any given night. The scale of that achievement becomes even clearer once you understand exactly how small these groups really were. The study's own conclusions describe individuals at Sungir as deriving from a population of small, effective size, with limited kinship and levels of inbreeding comparable to those found among long argument that had divided archaeologists studying. That's the exact controversy Naya's DNA was finally able to settle. Genetic analysis of mitochondrial DNA extracted from one of Naya's molars revealed that this prehistoric teenage girl carried genetic markers common to modern Native Americans, according to the researchers behind the study published in Science. The findings show that despite the clear physical differences between the skulls of the earliest Americans and the skulls of modern Native American populations, they were in fact significantly related, almost certainly deriving from the same original ancestral gene pool. Remaining biologically isolated was already firmly in place among some of the very first successful modern humans to settle in Europe, tens of thousands of years before anyone could have written the idea down or passed it on as formal cultural knowledge. It had to have been baked into the basic social fabric of how these people organized their entire lives. There's a genetically thrilling detail buried even deeper in the Sungir genomes, one that connects this single burial site all the way back to the very root of the modern human family tree. Phylogenetic analysis of the Y chromosome sequences recovered from the Sungir remains placed all of these individuals within an early, deeply divergent lineage of a genetic marker known as haplogroup C182. That specific haplogroup is now vanishingly rare